we are now happy to have Marco here, Marco Tomaszewski from the University of Freiburg, Albert-Ludwigs-Universität. Freiburg in Germany, southern Germany, who will present something on, present his paper on interwoven hinterland linen industry and society in eastern Switzerland. This is not just a passing interest of his, but actually his current research, postdoc project, that is DFG, German Research Council, funded individual project on the social and cultural history of the proto-industrial linen production in that area, a topic that has been not untouched, but is still under research, especially in the work relations of the region. And that is also, from what I understand, what is Marco bringing to us today. And so I'm looking forward to your talk and hope we'll have a lively discussion. Of course, again, I want to encourage our online audience to also post questions in the chat. I'll check every here and then if there's anything coming up. And now I give the word to Marco.
Best time for it. Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Angela, and for the invitation. I hope you can hear me, although. In the next 20 minutes, I will focus on eastern Switzerland, which is a region south of Lake Constance. For those who don't know it very well, so here, this region. And it's a region which was eminently characterized by proto-industrial linen production, or linen production in general, which was meant for export. It was quite similar to this region Angela mentioned before in Westphalia, with city centers and rural production, and I will come to that later. Linen was produced there as early as the 13th century, and from the 13th century onwards, there are some sources that linen from the region around Lake Constance, also from the northern parts in Swabia in southern Germany, but also from Switzerland, from northeastern Switzerland, were exported to North Africa and also to the Levante. And later in the 17th and 18th century, linen was also exported to the Americas and the Caribbean. The part of eastern Switzerland, south of the lake, with the center city of St. Gallen, was the main territory of this linen production until the 19th and 20th centuries. And from here, linen was exported all over Europe. That are all the cities where in the 16th centuries St. Gallen merchants had their trading branches. A main city was Lyon, which was a main market for linens from St. Gallen. And from this part of southern France and also from Spain, linen were further traded to the Americas and to the Caribbean in the 17th and more so in the 18th centuries. And not least because of these trading relations, Switzerland had some connections to the international slave trade as well. Swiss merchants were players in the transatlantic slave trade, and this is not part of my research really, but it's also an important issue, and I wanted to mention this here because it is not so well known, this engagement of Swiss merchants or of Switzerland in colonialism and slave trade and stuff like that. I am interested in the production in this region, in the production relations, and in the organization of this industry or proto-industry, however you would call it, of linen. And in the following, I will give an overview on the textile industry in this region, and then focus on one rural area, Appenzell, as one part of one of these rural parts where linen were produced, and also where flax was produced, and fibers and yarn. And actually, I've realized in the exhibition in this last room, the Future Technology Lab or Future Lab, or I've just seen one of these high-tech textiles. It's called Cefa Power Heat. It actually is produced in Appenzell, in Heiden, Appenzell. So it's some continuity as well in this region of textile productions, but not, not as plain as we would imagine. I will present 3 examples, more or less chronologically, in order to highlight some aspects I consider important. And I hope they are kind of understandable because I had to narrow down very much. And finally, I will reflect on how to analyze and understand such complex industries or proto-industries and their regions by suggesting a commodity chain approach and a network model or network metaphor. So I come to the first overview. The main characteristic for this region was that its condensed political structure. There were various competing political authorities here in which were first of all St. Gallen, which was an imperial city, so it was self-governed and it was independent. Then there was the Prince Abbey of St. Gallen, which is this area here, which was the territory of the monastery of St. Gallen. Then there were some parts which were jointly ruled by other cantons of the Swiss Confederation. These were the Thurgau and Rheintal here. And beside a smaller region in Austria, which is not so important now. And there was this Appenzell, this green part here, which was in former times also ruled by the Prince Abbey of St. Gallen, and then became independent in the 14th century and in the 15th century. And from then onwards, it was a rural canton of the Swiss Confederation, and it was self-governed like a city, you can say. There was a council, and the people from Appenzell were ruled themselves, governed themselves. It was kind of a peasants' republic, if you want to call it like that, very simplified said. So, and I would focus on. I would like to focus on this region now. But before, just say something, some points on the structure of this region. The linen industry in this region was organized as a purchasing system, if you want to call it like that, or if you want to speak in these terms of production systems, which means one definition is a purely market-oriented relationship between independent commercial producers and the merchants who purchased their products and sold them on export markets. So Angela today also presented this case of Westphalia, which is very similar to this, and so you have already an impression of that. One characteristic feature of this organization of production was that production usually was independent from trading, from export, and so merchants usually were not directly involved in the production, which does not mean that there were no putting out relations within this sphere of production. So production could also be supplemented by a production order of a artisan entrepreneur or some other capital person with capital for production, or supported by credit in money or in raw materials, and then you could also have putting out relations within this purchasing system. In the rural areas in this region, flax was cultivated, and flax was cultivated, the flax fibers were extracted, The spinning of yarn and the weaving of the cloth also took place as well, took place in the countryside as well as in the towns. And in the towns, cloths were then subjected to a quality control, also Angela mentioned before for Westphalia, the so-called Schau, sold to merchants, bleached, dyed, and prepared for export. The most important quality inspection, or Schau, and the most important market in this region was in St. Gallen. But there were also other smaller linen markets in this region as well. In St. Gallen, cloths were brought to the market both by weavers from the city, from the Urban Weavers Guild, and by people from the countryside, from the surrounding rural regions. And the city levied different taxes and duties, and these taxes varied on whether the sellers came from rural areas, from the rural surroundings, or from the city. So the rural people had usually to pay more taxes. Linens were sold to merchants, and there were some municipal brokers who managed the selling. That's not at the center of my presentation today. And beforehand, a quality control was held, the so-called Schau, as I mentioned before, which was carried out by sworn masters of the Weavers Guild. And the cloth the merchants purchased at this market then had to be bleached within the town. There was a norm that the cloth had to be bleached within the town and had to be dyed. If they should get a color, they had to also to be dyed within the town in municipal facilities. And then the linens were exported to European cities by the merchants. The city is therefore was not only a marketplace, but also, and that also was mentioned by Angela this morning for Westphalia, also a center of processing, of the processing industry. The main aim of the St. Gallen Council was to secure this position by attracting producers from the surrounding areas and thereby ensuring taxes as well as the operation of these bleaching plants and dyeing facilities, etc. And in this painting from 1714, 12 activities of the St. Gallen linen trade are depicted from the urban perspective, from the St. Gallen perspective in an ideal, typical manner. So it's not, of course, it's not a real image of the industry because, first of all, there are only male people. That's most impressive, and that it's not every step of production shown here. But of course, the merchant stands out on the left. So he's the first person, the most important person, but also who is also very very central in this picture is the bleacher here at the center, and he's also below the coats of arms of the city, and he's also stands out in color. So, and I think this is not a coincidence that this bleaching industry in this ideotypical image is so present and so central. So now I want to focus at the rural area and take the example of Appenzell. It was one of the areas where flax was grown, yarn was spun, and cloth was woven. And it was a neighboring rural area of the city of St. Gallen, as you've already seen. And agriculture was very specialized and commercialized there from the late Middle Ages onwards. There was less labor-intensive livestock and dairy farming, milk production, etc., which made labor available for the textile industry, and in turn, which made also Appenzell and the whole northeastern Switzerland dependent on grain imports. So there was not much agriculture in grain, so they had to import it from the parts of Swabia, north of the Lake of Constance, and were dependent on the grain market. At least from the 15th century onwards, people from Appenzell sold linens on the St. Gallen market. So from the 15th century onwards, there was a linen produced, there was weaving going on in Appenzell. And the first example I would show is from the 1530s, the early 16th century, when Appenzell linen producers, who were usually largely dependent on the St. Gallen market, on its regulations, on its Schau and the St. Gallen merchants, tried to establish an own linen market and an own export effort. So in the 1530s, the Appenzellers tried to emancipate themselves and set up their own quality inspection, their own Schau, and they founded a trading company to export Appenzell linens themselves, independent from the St. Gallen merchants. On the one hand, this was an attempt by a rural production area to become independent from the city. And on the other hand, it was an attempt to bring the spheres of production and export closer together. So this trading company had about, or there were about 20 people who acted as capital investors. One came from inner Switzerland, from another canton, which brought the most money. And there was another person who was very important, who came from St. Gallen, and he was called Caspar Guggi or Caspar Schumacher. The name is not so important. What is important is that he was basically the only person who had trading relations to export the linen. So he had a trading branch in Lyon, which was the main market, I said before, for linen, and he was the only merchant who had these trading relations in Appenzell. There were also some artisan entrepreneurs or production entrepreneurs who let produce huge amounts of linen. One of them, who was called Ulrich zu Brenten, one of them announced that he would bring 300 pieces of cloth to this new established Appenzell market. So there were some people who let produce greater amounts of linens and brought them to the market. This attempt to establish an own linen market resulted in conflicts with the city. First, over the resulting conflicts with the St. Gallen Council over the recognition of the Appenzell market, and the associated question of whether Appenzell was allowed to use certain quality marks, quality signs, which were very similar to those of St. Gallen. So we had a similar case in the exhibition with Oldenburg and Lübeck, I think. So Appenzell's attempt to establish its own market and its own export trading company finally failed. On the one hand, because St. Gallen was able to assert its position, especially in terms of these quality certification. But on the other hand, probably also because they had not enough trading relations all over Europe, because the only merchant they could attract, this Caspar Guggi, he died in 1537 unexpectedly, and with his death there was basically no possibility to sell their cloth or to export their cloth. And at the same time, we have to stress that the St. Gallen market remained important for the Appenzellers because it was the most important market in this region. And here too, conflicts arose from time to time over unequal treatment of the Appenzellers on this market in St. Gallen, in particular over increased taxes. So Appenzellers usually had to pay more taxes, or in some cases they had to pay more taxes. And these issues remained contested and were a part of conflicts throughout the 16th and 17th century from time to time, and led to renewed conflicts between Appenzell authorities and St. Gallen authorities. And these conflicts were about this linen market, but they were also about the yarn trade. And one fundamental conflict occurred here in the 1570s, in 1578 and 1579. The trade in flax fibers and in yarn was repeatedly the subject of normative sources, of mandates from the authorities, from Appenzell, but also from the city of St. Gallen and from the Prince Abbey as well. And it was also issue of conflicts between these three authorities. And first of all, these conflicts show, and the fact that there was a considerable yarn trade show that, and flax fiber trade with flax fibers. This shows that the flax which was spun in the rural areas was not necessarily grown by the same people who spun the flax. The people who spun flax into yarn were not necessarily the people who grow the flax. So, and that was therefore there was a trade in flax fibers. In German, it's called Werg. I don't know the English word, but flax fiber I think is more understandable. And in Appenzell, for example, there were traders who traded in fibers and in yarn, and they bought up large quantities to sell them on a profit. This was called in German Fürkauf, and this Fürkauf was prohibited by the Appenzell authorities as early as around 1560, but it continued to be practiced in the following period. And in the 1570s, the Council of the City of St. Gallen in particular urged the neighboring authorities to that trade in fibers and yarn fibers and yarn should only be traded on the official markets. So fibers and yarn should only be sold by the spinners, who were mostly female persons, sold by the spinners at the official markets in St. Gallen or in other smaller cities, smaller marketplaces in the countryside, and that all professional yarn traders or also fiber traders should be banned from these markets. Appenzell's position was ambivalent in this question because, on the one hand, the Appenzell representatives or the Appenzell authorities were against this profit-oriented trading in yarn and fibers. But on the other hand, they stressed that these traders were essentially important for the Appenzell spinners because they could not go to the markets, especially in winter times. The markets are too far away. They can, for example, not go from a small village in the mountains of Appenzell to the city of St. Gallen because it was too cold, the way was too far, they had to care for their children at home, and they rely on these traders who go from house to house or from, let's say, farm to farm and take their yarn to the market in St. Gallen, and they provide them also with food products. So, so these small traders in yarn, this was the argument of the Appenzell authorities, were necessary for the population in Appenzell, especially for the poor population and especially for these female spinners. Finally, in 1579, there was a contract between the city and Appenzell and the Prince Abbey, and there was something like a compromise, but the issue repeatedly came up in the following centuries, you can say. And it seems that for the authorities of the city, for the St. Gallen authorities, the yarn trade was primarily about supplying their own weavers with yarn. But it was also about their priority position on the market in order to be able to influence pricing. In the course of the conflict, the people of Appenzell complained about the market practices of the weavers and the merchants on the St. Gallen market, especially in times of winter when the yarn prices were low. Then Appenzellers who wanted, and again they're mostly female spinners who wanted to sell their yarn on the Appenzell market, often had to wait a very long time in the cold without being able to sell their yarn because nobody wanted it. And since they usually had to sell it and buy from the money they get food and then bring this food home to Appenzell, they, at least at the end of the day, they had to sell their yarn to every price. So they were forced to sell below value at the prices which were offered to them by the weavers of Appenzell. And this shows that this conflict was not only about this profit-oriented Fürkauf or this profit-oriented practices of the yarn traders, but for the city it was also about exploiting the rural spinners and to have influence on prices of yarn. And also, and therefore of cheap supply of yarn as a raw material or semi-finished material for the urban production. So the last example is 100 years more or less later. 100 years later, after the yarn conflicts, Appenzell succeeded in introducing and establishing its own market in a very small village, which is called Trogen. And this is connected to two merchants from, originally from St. Gallen again, who are called Hans Jakob and Bartholomew Gonzenbach, and who gave up their burger rights in St. Gallen and moved to a very, very small hamlet in the Thurgau, which is here, and established a bleachery, dye works, weaving workshops there. This hamlet before had around five houses, and then they built this production site for linen production, and they settled more than 200 people there. And this is a picture of it. This is itself a very remarkable story and very interesting story. But that's not my point here, and I could not go into detail here. But these two merchants, these brothers, were very important for this market in St. Gallen, because they announced to the Appenzellers that they would regularly buy linen in Appenzell directly, and that was the main cause that this market was established and worked for the next years. The sales list of the market in Trogen have been handed down, and this makes it possible to get at least some image of this market. But we have to keep in mind that we still are able to grasp only one part of this production in Appenzell via this market in Trogen. The producers from Appenzell continue to bring their cloth also to the St. Gallen market, so we have only one part of the production in this market in Trogen, and it's also only mostly people which are from the surrounding of Trogen, not, for example, from this region, so it's mostly people from Trogen itself and the surrounding villages. For this market in Trogen, so far I only started to analyze the first year, like one case, and in this first year, or it's the first year from which these sources are handed down, and in 1671 there were around 260 people who were selling linens on this market, and around 2,000 pieces of linen were sold there. There were 9 buyers who could be identified. These were Hans Jakob Gonzenbach, which I mentioned before, but also other buyers, other merchants from neighboring areas, as well as some buyers from Appenzell itself, and they acted as factors or as commission agents for the merchants. The majority of sellers only sold little amounts of linen. More than 50% of the sellers of these 260 people sold only 1 or 2 pieces of cloth during the whole year. That must not mean that they only produced 1 or 2 pieces of cloth, because they could also have produced further pieces for artisan entrepreneurs or fabricants. But on the market, they only sold 1 or 2 pieces during the year. And a rather small group of people brought the largest amount of cloth to the markets. 76% of all linens which were sold on this market in Drogen were sold by around 23% of the sellers. So 60 sellers out of these 260 sold 76%. One person was especially outstanding. He was called Hans Rechsteiner, and he sold 104 pieces of cloth, which is 5% of the whole amount during the whole year. So there were some linen entrepreneurs, some artisan entrepreneurs who let produce a considerable amount of linen by other people, while the majority of sellers on this market produced only 1 or 2 pieces. And some of these, it were these people who also acted as these commission agents for the merchants. Also, they also, not Hans Rechsteiner, but 2 other people who were linen entrepreneurs, also acted as buyers on these markets. So far, I wanted to give some impressions of the linen industry in this region of Eastern Switzerland. But I have to admit that in preparing this presentation, it has not been easy for me to briefly summarize or briefly describe these very complex issues. And I hope it was at least kind of understandable. But I think in general, pre-modern textile production is extremely complex, and it's often confusing, and because of this division of labor in very small steps, I think. And this makes analysis and interpretation very difficult. And I would be interested in hearing about your impressions from your own research for your regions. During the discussion or during the conference now. To be able to analyze and understand these complex production relationships, for me it seems a useful approach to start from the commodity chain as a heuristic tool, an approach which goes back, as you probably know, to sociological research linked to Emanuel Wallerstein, which focused on global production processes, and which was interested mainly in global production processes, but as Andrea Caracausi has shown, could also be applied to regional production as well, and could also apply to link these regional production to global commodity chains. Quote, the starting point of a commodity chain-based approach is to conceive of a commodity as the outcome of a labor and production process network. Each single production process can be viewed as a box or a nodal point, which is in turn connected to other nodal points within the network, unquote. So in Eastern Switzerland, the linen industry, in the linen industry of Eastern Switzerland, these steps are flux cultivation, then the trading of the flux cultivation and extraction of the fibers, then the trade of the flux fibers, then spinning yarn, then trading yarn, weaving, the trade of unbleached linen in the cities, in the markets, then the process of bleaching, the trade of white linen sometimes, and then finishing, which is itself more complex than I showed it here, and then export, very roughly put. Particularly revealing and interesting are the connections or nodal points, I think, between the production steps, which are the the markets of the flax fibers, of yarn, and of this unbleached linen. And the prices which are paid here directly and indirectly remunerated the labor of the preceding steps, and also it was very relevant for the authorities in the region, because these were also the conflict points, trading which we've seen before, the trading in flax fibers, trading in yarn, and the linen markets. And from that perspective, the organization of the linen industry appears not characterized by a clear dichotomy, as it is shown here, by a city center or a center and a hinterland or periphery. Rather, it could be conceived as a complex multi-centered network with various nodes and centers. That's not a true scheme of a network. It's just to give some impression of this complexity, let's say. And also in the introduction to this morning, Angela, you've spoken about the textile industry as a multi-layered system of relationships, and highlighted the agents as well. And yeah, I think that's one parallel, I think, to this network image. This network metaphor was proposed by Sitta van Rheden in a handbook of ancient empires and ancient economies. And in her understanding, or in the understanding of the authors of this handbook, such networks, quote, have multiple centers, nodes, entangled with other centers, between which various flows traverse in multiple directions across multiple ties. And from that perspective, instead of being a hinterland or periphery, Appenzell was an essential part and a nodal point within the network. While dependent on St. Gallen in many ways, it also had its own agency and its own network power, you can say. And instead of the center of the linen industry, St. Gallen then was just one center within the network, beside other centers. And its important function, its central function, was always disputed and threatened, which was also a reason for these ongoing conflicts, because they always tend to defend their network power. So I think the network model can be used to explain change in the production process or in production without falling into decline narratives or falling into teleological concepts such as the proto-industrialization concept, but can conceptualize changes within this network on another level. The nodal points or centers in the network need not to be territorial. They not need to be tied to state power or to authorities. Agents also can function as nodes, agents or actors. Quote, in overlapping networks, actors can function as nodes, quote, in overlapping networks, which include cities, but also itinerant people, supra-local organizations, and landscapes. As nodes, these actors link and interact with other actors. So nodal points in the linen industry in this case are markets, institutions as the quality inspection, but also certain actors like the merchants or the entrepreneurs who had considerable amount of power within the network. And these actors were very hybrid and variable nodes, and the actors in turn were embedded in complex networks, and some, such as cities, are networks unto themselves. So the actors themselves were acted as, for example, linen merchants, but they also were part of the city's council, or production entrepreneurs in Appenzell were also part of the council in Appenzell. And so we have a very complex network which had several levels Organizations such as guilds and city councils were nodal points, which themselves were networks of different actors. Individual actors were, for example, merchants or producers, while at the same time being part of the authorities. Further research should therefore ask more specifically who actually participated in these, in the authorities, the councils, etc., and also the guilds, and what interests were represented by them. Yeah, I hope that I could provide some impression of the linen industry in Eastern Switzerland, and in the last part, it was my goal to provide one perspective for research on early modern or pre-modern or proto-industrial or whatever we would call it, export textile production. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I have many questions, but I'm happy to stand back first and let others ask. I didn't want to,
Thank you. Well, thank you for your presentation. I would like to ask, before the Appenzell company, where did ended up the linen production of the region? I mean, because if I understood well, if I understood well, sorry, my mind went out. There was great production in the region before the company, so they went to St. Gallen market, or
They went to St. Gallen market, and that's what they did in the following centuries as well, and that's what they did. I tried to mention that also in the time in the 17th century when they had their own market in St. Gallen, in this village of Trogen, they also went to the St. Gallen market because there were, I think in St. Gallen were around 20,000 pieces of cloth traded in the year, and in Trogen it was 2,000. So it was, the market in St. Gallen was very huge. It was very important. There were more merchants who were buying cloth, and so this market remained important during the whole time.
So in short, let me continue. The St. Gallen merchants didn't want it that nobody moved outside, because what I heard or what I understood is like they wanted everybody came to his market in order not to move. Like they acted in some way like a guild, because they didn't wanted no one to be more important or prominent by taking a strong relation with the rural producers.
That's one interesting point, and that's one point which I think somebody or me has to research further, because there were several. As you mentioned it, there was the guild of St. Gallen, the Weavers Guild, who represented the urban producers, but also the bleachers. And there were merchants in St. Gallen, like, for example, also these Gonzenbach brothers. And some of them were not content with this system, that they were forced to let their linens bleach in St. Gallen, and that that this market was so important. And that was an attempt of the city's council, because they got the taxes and they run these bleaching factories, etc. And one cause for the Gonzenbachs, or that caused Gonzenbach to establish their own bleaching factory in this small village. So that's a very, I think that's a very complicated thing. Which actors within the cities actors within the city had different interests. So, and merchants were represented in the city's council, but there were also the weavers represented there, and I think that's the interesting question which I tried to mention in the last part, that we have to take a closer look at these interests within the authorities as well as in Appenzell. So Appenzell producers, Appenzell spinners, and later on merchants, they had different interests, but as the land or as the authority, they speak with one voice. So yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Marco, thank you so much for giving us the image of such a vivid society at that time. I'm wondering about the sources you had. I mean, you showed us how to say catalog. Okay, but except of that, which were your sources? I would like also to, as a lawyer, I'm quite interested on the conflicts, maybe before any courts at that time, if there were any. And among
sorry?
At the court, any, yes, court decisions about such conflicts, and who were the applicant and the... And the third question is, in this society where women played probably a crucial role in linen, have you seen, is there any official role in this cycle of linen in
For women?
Women, yes. Names or which kind of officially, which was their role at that time and place? Thank you.
Yeah, the sources is, I think, for the whole pre-modern period a problem, but in this area as well, and that's more or less a late example in my field of study, and it's almost an exception. So for this market, we have these lists, and we could analyze them. We don't almost know nothing about the market in St. Gallen. So we know the amounts of pieces, but we do not know much about the sellers and buyers and stuff like that. We have sources, especially from these conflicts, where the authorities, they made contracts. They disputed. They met on some they met on meetings and discussed these things. And then there are written records. And so via these conflicts we can get an image. We have minutes, records of the Council of St. Gallen, where issues of the linen trade are discussed, and stuff like that. And above all, we have the normative sources. So, but that's the normative level, and but in turn we can get an impression of the practice as well. So, for example, they are constantly prohibiting giving credits on linen cloth, for example, stuff like that. And yeah, it's prohibited, but these prohibitions occur from the 16th to the 18th century onwards. So it was a common practice, I think. There were courts, but there were courts in St. Gallen, or also the St. Gallen Council acted as a court, but that was for conflicts within the city mostly, because all these different areas were politically independent, more or less. So they were part of the Swiss Confederation, and that was also one of one authority, you can say. So comparatively compared to the European Union perhaps today. So this was the Swiss Confederation was a community of the cantons, and then they also solved such conflicts. So these conflicts between Appenzell and St. Gallen were sometimes solved by the Swiss Confederation, and but the conflicts between these different authorities were solved by contracts and like international contracts, and how they were performed afterwards dependent on the authorities, I would say. Yeah. And the role of women, basically, they played a role in production, but there was almost no official role, and that's why they in these 12 occupations of the linen industry they do not appear. But we have here a picture cycle from the 17th century, which depicts also from an urban perspective the whole linen trade, and there the women appear. So they appear here in this spinning, of course, but also, which is very interesting, in the collecting of taxes here. I mean, I think you cannot see it very well, but and in the written sources they are not mentioned. And which is also very interesting, there is one product in the 17th century which is called Stauchen in German. It's like it's a special smaller type of linen, which is also connected to fashion in the 17th century. And when that was introduced, there was a special technique to finish it. And there was one occupation which was only performed by an official occupation within these municipal industry plants, which was only performed by women. So Stuchentrocknerinnen, they were called. So, and you can see them there. And I don't know why exactly this part of the production was performed by women. But that's the only official role, which was only for women.
We do have a question from online. Dörte asks, where did they trade the linen to? Where did they trade the linen to, locally or else in a wider range? Do you know for what fabric linen yarn was used for?
Where the trade?
Where did they trade the linen to?
Okay.
Was it just in Switzerland or?
It was all over Europe, and later on it was even further. So that's a map which was made in 1960 by a Swiss economic historian, and he mapped all the cities where linen were traded to in the 16th century. So basically also the Hanse area, and basically all over Europe, and also to the Mediterranean area. And so that's where linen were traded first, and from there onwards, especially then in the 17th and 18th century, it was also traded overseas to the Caribbean and to the Americas. But also before, there are sources from the 13th century which mention linen from the Lake Constance area, Bodensee area, in Genua on the one hand, but also the sources are from Genua, but they mention linens from this area in Ceuta in northern Africa, and 2 or 3 other cities in this area.
Addition about the trade of St. Gallen cloth, not cloth, linen. It was so important. This St. Gallen linen was the most important linen, I would say, imported linen in Hungary from the late Middle Ages. It was so important that the color in Hungarian called galler. It means
really?
something from Gallen, St. Gallen.
Ah,
So it was
okay.
extremely important. So the main bleached white linen was from St. Gallen, and it is mentioned from the late 15th century onwards through the 17th century. Always, it's called Galler. Just in
Yeah,
the addition.
thank you very much. That's not only interesting, but also because, as Angela mentioned a little bit before, that this area is a little kind of understudied or not in the mind of many people, and it's always Flanders and Westphalia and except for people specialized in the textile industries, pre-modern textile industries, it's not so in mind that it was an area which not only produced. I think that was the question from Dörte as well. Was it regional production? But no, it was European-wide and also globally. Yeah.
And there is even a cloth seal for St. Gallen cloth, not cloth for St. Gallen linen production. That is also quite important. Yeah, they used seals, leaden seals.
Yeah, and the trademark, the seal, from the
Because in Osnabrück it's stamps, so
okay, It's
you mean actual cloth seals, like okay.
And there are sources about imitation of St. Gallen cloth from the Frankfurter Fair.
No, okay.
Somebody told that this seal is actually doesn't look like it has to be.
I think I have to ask you a few more
I think
questions later.
I
But
see a great friendship about St. Gallen cloth. But that kind of connects to a question that I want to squeeze in, like where is it traded? Because I've been wondering, but this is also a general question also for the other contributions in this conference. Why these markets? As you said, I mean, they are traded everywhere, right? But Caribbean, Americas, I mean, is it really because of the quality, only because of the quality of the cloth? Or is it because we need something to export because we want to actually import something to Europe? Like, is it, yeah, you know.
Yeah,
Because if you want to bring sugar, you need to bring something in exchange, right? So I think I do want to focus on textiles here, but it's of course an interesting question if you just need something to bring and the stuff that you have and that they want is incidentally linen.
Yeah. So you mean it must not be the quality of St. Gallen linens, but also other reasons.
So by whose demand is it actually
Yeah.
driven? By
And
the target market or by your own?
Yeah, and also the possibilities of trade. So the most important market, at least in the 16th, 17th centuries and 18th century, was Lyon, where was a huge fair for textiles, and people merchants from the Swiss Confederation, they had privileges in Lyon, in the fair, and I think also during the whole year. And that was one reason why they exported linen from the Swiss Confederation and not so much from Germany, for example. And so that's not a quality reason, but legal privileges. Furthermore, there were more than one quality. I mean, these quality signs they classified linens, and they were.
So there's the top quality obviously going to Hungary, and then maybe the shitty stuff going to the Caribbean, I don't know. Yeah, but I mean, that's interesting. I think if it's like, if it's first what's the motivation for building up and expanding a textile industry? Is it really, the demand elsewhere, or also what you can get in exchange? Also, another question, if I may, is like market access. You talked a lot about market access of the rule, like a bit what I also had in my morning presentation. Find that quite interesting. How much do you think in your area of a choice did producers like both of yarn and of linens had to go to different markets? Because you talked about Appenzell and St. Gallen, and it's quite an interesting question, right? How much opportunity did they have to seek out different markets and thus participate a bit more freely in the market economy?
Yeah, I think we have to look at this very context related for the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, and so on, and we have to have in mind that there are several linen markets in this region as well. For example, there's one event in the 1520s in St. Gallen, which I think I mentioned it in the last Euroweb conference, and which I haven't understood really so far, and that is the quality inspection in St. Gallen was very harsh at this time. They were very they banned many linens from the show, or they classified them quite with bad signs, and that led to the fact that producers, sellers went to other cities, to Constance, for example. But yeah, and I so far I don't understand what was the purpose behind this practice, but this gives an impression that they had some agency and they had some choice. But I think what is very crucial, and that's that can be seen in this example from Appenzell from the 1530s, is the role of the merchant. So people you need people who export your linen, or who buy your linen, and if they change the market, I think that's the most important thing. Yeah.